Thank you for tuning in to another episode of One More Story. Just a quick programming note, parents, if you'd like to skip past the interview and go straight to the first story, you can find it at the 21-minute, 30-second mark. And as a reminder, we are celebrating Spooky Month, and the second story in particular is especially creepy and could be a little scary for some kids. Also, the interview is definitely not for kids. It gets pretty heavy as we discuss the relationship between horror and religion. So, with all those disclaimers in mind, please sit back, relax, and enjoy tonight's episode. My guest tonight is Owen Egerton. He is an award-winning filmmaker and novelist, the writer-director of Mercy Black, Follow, and Bloodfest. He is also the author of the story collection How Best to Avoid Dying, and the novels Everyone Says That at the End of the World, and the Book of Harold, the Illegitimate Son of God. His most recent novel, Hollow, was named one of the best books of the year by NPR. Owen, welcome to the show.
Hi, Peter. Thanks for having me.
It's so good to see you. I'm happy you could come on. You also have a new short story in the Haunted Reels anthology, Dead No Longer.
That's right. Yeah, it's a pretty fun collection. I've been slowly working my way through it. I'm like, oh wow.
Yeah, no, I've only read a couple so far, but it's impressive. I'm curious because I literally just read yours about a half an hour ago.
Oh,
because I wanted to make sure that I had plenty to talk about and ask about, and it was tough to read because I'm a parent, as you are.
Yeah.
What was your inspiration for that?
Dead No Longer was a way back. I had just an idea of like, well, what if there was a zombie apocalypse, but the zombies were just kind of loitering, like they didn't want to eat us, and wouldn't that be horrible in its own kind of way? We're not being chased or hunted. They're just there. And I kind of started playing around with that. And then basically I got kind of personal with some, family issues and some nightmares of my own. And then I got into the story in a darker way because I thought there was something kind of funny about zombies that don't hunt us and are just annoying. They're in the trash. Like, get out of here. But when I started thinking about people in my family and people in my life and sort of hurting my way into a narrative, that's where the story came about. It was hard for me to write, so I'm glad it was hard to read to an extent, but it was hard to write. But like, I don't know if you feel this, Peter, but for me, the best kind of, whether it's playing a role or writing a script or writing a story or writing a novel, is when you come out of the other end a little changed.
Yes,
and the story or the part or the film has told you something, as opposed for you just using it as a vehicle to tell other people something.
Right.
So for that one, it told me something, and it was good for me to hear.
In a way, you can learn from your own subconscious.
Yeah. I do believe that we're just laying out with the tarot cards every time we write.
Yeah, and I do feel like the best stuff I've written has been the hardest, but when you do come out of the other side of that, it's quite a cathartic experience. And a lot of your work, you deal with faith and religious themes. I'm curious what your upbringing was like and why that is such an integral part of your work.
Yeah, I've been thinking. It's funny, I've had conversations with some of your other guests about some of this. It's true. I'm kind of a bit of a religion junkie. I'm fascinated. What I'm fascinated with? I'm fascinated with aspects of faith.
Mm-hmm.
I think humans' ability to believe in something that sometimes they know not to be true is an amazing ability. It's wild. I mean, what gives us sort of the ability to, power through when the odds are against us, right? Like a Ukrainian soldier fighting against what's meant to be a superpower. And then I believe we can be victorious, although all evidence says different. That's impressive. But it's the same kind of muscle, the same ability that leads to, I believe that Donald Trump is still president and will be for life. That sort of ability to believe, although all the evidence is against us, is the most absurd, most dangerous, and the most beautiful thing about being human, I think.
Right.
For me, on a like personal level, basically, I got very, very religious as a teenager. Not because of my family, but I just became like I became a born again Christian and as a teenager, and I just sort of dove deep into that world for about 10 years, and that was everything for me. It was the sort of center, like the side, it defined how I thought and what I read and who I hung out with and who I didn't sleep with and all these different aspects of my life. And then later on, I was like, gosh, this is unhealthy. This is like, having a profession, because for a while I was like hired by an evangelical group as my one real job outside of college. It's like, oh gosh, my job is telling kids that they deserve hell. And I broke away from that world. I basically broke up with Jesus, but I've remained a little bit, like the person who's like kind of still obsessed with their ex, like still checking on Facebook of like, what's the ex up to? That's me and Jesus. So a little bit like, I don't know what's going on. What's going on with those Christians out there? So I've got, I think, a lot of thoughts about the danger of evangelical Christianity to our country and our world, but also trying to balance it with like, well, I suppose maybe there's some aspects of compassion and aspects of, I don't know, I'm trying to sort of balance all the different aspects of religion in my thinking and my studying.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some core good takeaways. I think the danger becomes when it becomes weaponized and exclusive.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. It was saying that weaponized and exclusive. It's a wild, again, the ability to believe. And we come from these traditions and they come down to us, right? And traditions going way, way back. And there's a wonderful aspect when like a religious tradition gives us the language or the ritual to experience sacredness, right? Mm-hmm. We don't have much sacredness these days. We're kind of we're a culture that sort of has left magic behind in so many ways that we seldom sort of set aside a space or a time that we call sacred. We do it every now and then, like weddings we'll do it with. And sometimes like, particular holidays we'll do it with in some spaces. But overall, we don't recognize the world as enchanted in the way that we used to. But our tradition sort of helps us. I think that's really cool and kind of brilliant. That's some of the beautiful part of religion. But man, also, I sometimes get worried if the reigning myth, like the fundamental myth in a culture, which is filled with a bunch of myths, but is that we are all so deserving of hell that God needs to just burn and punish us forever. But luckily, he loves us enough that he took his one son who never did anything, was innocent. I was like, I'm just going to beat the crap out of this one. Boom, 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 boom. Because I love you so much. So watch what I'm doing to your sibling. Go, 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 go. I really want to be doing this to you, but I'm like, that's kind of messed up, right? Like, yeah. So if we kind of like as a myth, as we keep talking about that, even if like we don't believe it, but that's like the myth of like, oh my God, I'm such a horrible human being that this had to happen on the cross. I don't know if that's good for us. Is this the part the kids are listening to, Peter?
No, my daughter would listen to this and never sleep again. And these are the things that would keep me up as a 5-year-old, being raised Catholic and thinking about heaven and hell and all of that. And it informed my approach to writing and horror in particular in a pretty meaningful way. What's the relationship you see with horror and religion?
Oh, yeah, I totally. I mean, here's a couple of things that I love. The aspects that I'm wowed by in religion are those things that talk about an enchanted world and talk about like a weird world, like a world that doesn't quite make sense in reason and logic and science, but we go with it. And I think of all the sort of genres out there, horror does that really well. Mm-hmm. Like horror shows us a world that is sort of, it's the tension between what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. And I get kind of creepy about it. I mean, Nietzsche talked about Greek tragedy in the same way of sort of having this sort of tension between what makes sense and sort of the wild, crazy drunkenness of human nature, right? Mm-hmm. And you put them together and you get what he said, that's the nature of Greek tragedy, of Greek drama. I see it like these moments, right, where we have an enchanted world that we get to believe in for a while. whether it's, a little boy seeing, dead people in Sixth Sense, or a guy who kills us in our dreams, there's like a cool kind of like, there's a myth and there's a magic to it. And although it's a dark sort of myth and a dark kind of magic, a dark enchantment, we still get to believe that the world is more than what we see and smell and touch. Like, there is more to it. And I think that's sort of thrilling in that way. I also think that it was religion, and I think this is a benefit. Religion did teach me early on that people die, right? No one else was telling me about it. No one else was talking about people dying. But religion, Catholicism, like the evangelical tradition that I came into, centered on it. Like the most important event ever was someone dying, brutally dying. And the other people that told me that people died was horror. Horror movies did it. I was like, oh yeah, these teenagers didn't do anything. They just stopped out of an abandoned house and just walked around that. And now they're all being slaughtered, not because of anything they did. And they couldn't escape it with their skill, their talent, their morality. Nothing could help them. They're just going to die. And that was a pretty good lesson. I think I needed to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, the crucifixion is one of the most horrific things you could... And in retrospect, given, now that I'm an adult and I have some perspective on these things, to introduce the brutal crucifixion to a young child is terrifying. I mean, we're exposed to horror when you grow up with religion. You are immediately exposed to horror.
Yeah, it is true. Like it is the art, right, on the wall. Like, oh my God, that is a naked, bleeding man with nails in his hand. What happened there? I'm like, don't worry, God did it because he loves you. I'm like, oh, okay. Well, can I go back to Sunday school?
Well, and I also think, you're talking about the fantastical and the myth, and I do think we're all looking for answers, right? And so horror can provide those answers. Faith can provide those answers to things that I feel like we will never know the answer until it's time, whatever that means. I don't know what that means, but I feel like there's, and we talked about this when I had Justin and Aaron on. We did a deep dive on UFOs.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And the Pentagon's the hearings, and at the end of the day, where I've landed is that there is just so much we do not know about this infinite universe, infinite space and time, that we can't wrap our brains around it. So we come up with these stories. We tell stories.
That's a great way of putting it. Yeah, we tell stories, and I think this is why I like horror. And we tell stories to contain the weirdness, to contain the unknown, right? And when the story pretends that it does, like, there we go, the ribbon on top, everything makes sense. That often, like, it can be fun. You're like, phew, that feels good. At the end of the movie, the princess found the prince, and the bad person was accidentally died, and no one is even guilty of killing the bad person. And phew, and the beast becomes a good-looking prince again, and we feel okay. It's fun to play in that world, but it doesn't echo reality. It doesn't echo the weirdness of the world. And then you get a movie like, let's take Halloween, classic horror movie, right? In Halloween, like, oh my God, there's utter evil trying for no reason, no motivation to murder people. And then there's Donald Pleasance, right, chasing down to try and stop him. We get this sort of like, okay, Donald Pleasance is order, and Michael Myers is disorder and chaos. And oh my God, thank God, boom, 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 6 times, falls off the lead. Like, great, order has been maintained. Order has triumphed over the brief chaotic reign of Michael Myers. And that would be a kind of typical ending. That would say, see, the world makes sense. Sometimes chaos comes in, but then horror does the last look, when Donald Pleasance looks over the edge and the body's gone. Michael Myers is gone, which doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit with the rules. And yet we see that and we go, oh yeah, that does. And it echoes the weirdness of the world. And we go like, and I mean weirdness with a capital W. That movie, because of that ending, speaks to me of the strangeness of the world. So order doesn't just win. It's just a momentary thing. And chaos doesn't play by the rules.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, I could talk about this for hours because I'm endlessly fascinated by it. But I do want to hear a little bit. You just started a new teaching job.
Yeah.
Talk about that. Some big changes in your life.
Big changes. Yeah. We got out of Texas. I lived in Austin, Texas for most of this millennium. So since 91, basically. And we raised a family there. But Texas is becoming, a nice way of putting it, horrible as a state. The people are still wonderful. And so many friends and family and community is there. But the state was becoming a toxic threat to my family, to trans people, to, working to ban books that are teaching different histories or teaching sexuality, erasing identities and making different people illegal in so many different ways. And we were like, well, we've got to get out for our family's sake. And so we did. And I found a job. Luckily, I'm very thrilled. Emerson College here in Boston was looking for a screenwriting professor. And I applied, not expecting, honestly, Peter, to get the job. But I did get the job, and I'm loving it. It's a really wonderful community of creative folks teaching all kinds of film and television and performance stuff.
Oh man, that sounds awesome. So you are a screenwriter and you're also a novelist. Can you talk a little bit about the different approach and sort of exercising those two different muscles if they feel different to you? Because they feel different to me, and I just want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, it's a great question. With the two strikes going on right now, with the industry kind of in a pause, which is so difficult for so many folks, I have actually been working on a novel, and it is interesting. It definitely is a different set of muscles than a screenplay. And what I'm trying to do is I'm hoping that my two styles of writing can influence each other. I think probably I'm a better novelist than I am a screenwriter. I think maybe because I worked a lot early in my career doing rewrites for studios, and I think that might have hurt me as little as a writer. Been a little too eager to please as a writer in screenwriting, and I'm trying to kind of like free myself in that mental space. When in novels, I was more like, I'm just going to put all the weirdness that I want. And if someone's willing to come along on the journey, great. But I wasn't really as worried in novels of like audience sales or commercial ideas or pleasing an executive. So I'm trying to kind of like hopefully influence each other because, it's nice to have some sort of commercial sensibility in my novels. That would help too. But I think, one aspect, of course, is when I'm writing a screenplay, I have a clear map. I know where I'm going. There's a rhythm and a pace and a conclusion that I'm moving to. And I'm a big believer in structure. When I'm writing a novel, I allow myself much more to get lost. I get lost in ideas. I get lost in voice. I sort of wander around, and later on, I'll sort of trim out the parts where I get lost in boring places. But getting lost and maybe getting a little mad, a little, losing it a little bit is a good part of my novel writing experience. In both places, I think when I'm at my best is when I'm haunted by whatever I'm writing. I'm like, oh gosh, this is starting to scare me. And I don't mean because it's horror. My novels aren't horror. The one I'm working on now is, but usually my novels aren't horror. But there are ideas and questions that scare me. And when I find those questions that scare me and I say, well, it's time for me to spend some time with them, I find that's a good way into writing.
Were there any favorite books you had as a child, specifically bedtime stories?
Oh, bedtime stories. Yeah. I mean, I was a fan of Shel Silverstein, of course. His poems, which are funny and dark and just brilliant songs. Those were always a big one. I was always a fan of Roald Dahl stories. Again, funny and dark, and actually often hideously violent. Those are really fun. And then on another side, my family immigrated from England when I was a very little kid. And there were these stories like the Secret Seven and the Fantastic Five. And there were these like kids on vacation, like, hello, Charlie, let's make some marmalade sandwiches and find out who stole the mine diamond. And, they're always solving little mysteries, or usually while on vacation. And solving the mysteries was always great. But was as good as like what I loved about these books, and there's a bunch of them, was they would always say like, and then we stopped and mother made us more marmalade sandwiches and tea for all of us. Hey. And I was like, ooh, that tea and marmalade, that's just like, it was like these wonderful comfort moments that I loved in those stories.
Oh, I love that. So as an adult now, what's your method for unwinding at night?
I do like whiskey. I love hanging out with my family, right? I'm really a family nerd. I remember not sort of thinking anything about that. At one point, Cargill, who you know, was like, yeah, introduced me to someone, like, here's Owen, he's a real family guy. And I'm like, I am? Am I really? I'm like, oh, I guess I kind of am. Because like dinner with my family, like making dinner with my family, hanging out with my wife and talking. And I love that. And our family dinners are goofy, and my kids end up singing songs and stepping on the chairs and making up. It's just a rambunctious, weird little, like it's like an episode of Glee, but during a meal. And so that is a fun part of winding down. And then, you know, I'm not a fast reader, but I do love reading. So I'm sort of, if I can just sort of settle down into a chair or in bed and open up a book, like a scary little story, that makes me a happy little sleeper.
All right. Well, that's actually a perfect segue into some stories, and one of them will be a scary little story. So, Owen, are you ready for the story relay?
I am ready.
All right. The word is toenail. Once upon a time, there was a very old man who lived in a very old village, and his name was Clarence. And Clarence was a very adventurous old man. He lived alone, but he had lots of friends in the village, and he had lots of friends in neighboring villages, and he would often go on long walks to visit these friends in these villages. Well, one day, he woke up, he brewed himself a strong pot of English breakfast tea, squeezed a lemon in, as was his tradition. He wasn't a milk and sugar guy. He had issues with dairy, as some people do. And so he would just squeeze a little lemon in that tea, and he would sit on his porch of his modest house in his old modest village, and he would sip on his tea and just look out at the beautiful scenery around him. And the village was pretty spread out, and it had been built into the forest. So if you can imagine Clarence on his porch in his morning robe, he had an evening robe, he had a morning robe, and he only wore his evening robe in the evening, and he only wore his morning robe in the morning, and he loved it. It's like a French terry kind of fabric. It was very soft, and he would just shrug his shoulders, he'd sip on his hot tea, the steam would rise off of his cup of tea, and he would look out into the forest, through the village. Occasionally he'd see a deer pass by, maybe a neighbor's dog who would come up and pet him. He always kept, in one of his robe pockets, he always kept a few bits of bacon for the neighborhood dogs who would come by and visit. He didn't have a dog of his own, but he loved dogs. You know, he was like everyone's favorite uncle. No kids of his own, no dogs of his own, but he loved everyone else's kids, everyone else's dogs. One morning, this dog named Barney came up, as Barney was known to do. Barney was his most frequent visitor. Barney was a beautiful black lab, and Barney went straight for the pocket of Clarence's robe because Barney knew where the bacon was, and Clarence reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of bacon, and he gave it to Barney, and Barney just devoured it right there, looked up at Clarence with a look of gratitude, and then Barney's attention turned to Clarence's bare feet, and Clarence followed Barney's attention, and he looked at his own bare feet for the first time this morning. He hadn't checked his feet. Who does? They're just feet. They're always on you. And he noticed what Barney noticed. One of his toenails was twice as long as the rest, and it was not the same color as all of his other toenails. It had been painted in the color of a rainbow.
Now, Clarence was not a man to be overly excited by anything. He had seen great things in his time. He had experienced plenty of adventures in his walks from village to village, but this sight of his own toenail twice as long and maybe growing longer as he looked at it, and the color of the rainbow sent a shudder through his spine. Even Barney the dog seemed to whine and mutter a little bit, and Clarence knew there had to be something he could do. Now, his town was very nice. It was filled with all kinds of good people, but none of them he would call wise. No, wise people lived through the forest. Probably the next town over is a wiser community, he would say. In fact, he knew one man who was one town over, maybe 5 miles through the darkest part of the forest, who was an expert in all things feet and fungal. And he thought, aha, I'll go see Philip, the feet and fungal maestro. So he stepped off his porch without even changing out of his morning robe and found his way into the forest, moving at a brisk pace. I'll be there and back by evening, able to change into my morning robe, my evening robe, and have a nice glass of chamomile tea, which is what he had in the evening because the caffeine from English breakfast will keep you up all night long. He was only 20 yards into the forest when he realized that Barney was trotting along with him. Good to have you along on the adventure, Barney, he said, and the two of them struck their way into the forest. Now, as he walked, it seemed that the air grew a little cooler. Maybe it was just because he was out of the sun, but no, there was something chilling in the way that the shadows stretched across the path in front of him. And he realized that he wasn't wearing any shoes. Well, of course, he had left in kind of a hurry, and how could he fit a shoe over that toenail? Oh my gosh, it was 4 times as long now, almost as long as his foot, scraping ahead of him. Well, no, a shoe would be quite impossible. And he was a little bit unnerved and found himself very grateful to have Barney next to him. He tried to whistle, but the sound fell silent and muted in the midst of the mossy wood. He tried to hum a little bit, but even that sounded too trying, too eager, maybe too desperate. So instead, he let himself just fall silent and listen to the sounds around him. Now, Clarence was known to love the sounds of a forest. He loved the sound of a squirrel chewing on bark, or the weird sounds of a possum getting into a fight with a pine cone. All these sounds were music to his ears. Even birds twittering to him was something wonderful. But today, he heard nothing. There were no squirrels fighting with bark, or possums arguing with pine cones, or birds twittering to one another. No, everything in the woods felt cold and quiet and shadowy. Now, he was not a man to be scared, as I've mentioned before, but he was a man to be aware of his circumstances. He had a toenail that was now 8 feet long, covered with all the colors of the rainbow, and as he noticed, closer to his toe, there were new colors, different from the rainbow, as if brand new colors that he had never seen were being born on his very toe. And he was only halfway toward the next village to see Philip, the master of fungal foots and other things with F. What was he going to do? In this strange circumstances, what was going to happen to his foot? Why was the forest so quiet? And just when he thought, no, I can't go a step further. I have to return to my home, to my tea, to my front porch, to the comforts of the house that I know. A figure stepped out of the woods. This figure was tall. This figure had skin that didn't look like flesh, but instead looked like the very bark of the trees surrounded him. He seemed to have a beard, but the beard was not hair, but instead the green moss that grew on the trees and the rocks of the forest. He had eyes, but the eyes were not the pupils that you see in a human being. Instead, they were polished stones, and they looked down at Clarence and stared deep into him and said, "Sir, I would like to bargain with you." Now, Clarence knew that if you met a figure in the woods, a figure that he had never seen before, that this was someone you had to show respect to. There's no running away. Clearly, this friend fella who had legs that looked like tree trunks would easily overtake him. There was no ignoring him. That would be really, really rude, and you don't want to ignore Spirit of the Woods. He just had to converse with him. "Why, sir, I'm in my bathrobe. I have nothing to bargain with." But you do. You have something I desire." Now Clarence got a little worried. What could this mean? His robe? No. His dog? Well, not his dog, but the dog that had followed him. No. The bacon left in his pocket? No. Instead, the tall, tree-like man said, "I want your toenail."
Well, Clarence was taken aback by this. I mean, after he realized that this wooded warrior spirit bearded entity in the forest was probably not interested in a terry cloth bathrobe and probably didn't want the bacon bits that were left over in his robe pocket, and probably didn't want to join him for evening tea, he suspected it could be the now 10-foot multicolored Toenail. And he thought, well, I mean, I need to get something in return for this because this thing seems special. I mean, this has never happened to me. I don't know anyone in any of the neighboring villages, all my friends. No one I know. I've never even heard of this happening. It's not even in any of our mythology. This is obviously something very special. I'm in a bit of a predicament because I would like to get up and run away, but I have a 10-foot piece of toenail jutting out from my foot and I can't run. I'm sort of stuck here. But I don't want to give this up for free because this is obviously very special. It is a gift from the forest gods, he thought. He was a deeply spiritual man and he spent a lot of time in the forest, and he would often talk to the animals, and he had a deep, deep respect for the ways of the natural world. And he wondered what this forest entity would give in return, so he asked. And this forest entity said,
Now Clarence looked into the eyes of this tree man, and the tree man looked back at him, and both of them knew that they were at a crossroads. What could it be? One barky tree nail for one massively now 27-foot-long, multicolored, humming toenail. That's right, the toenail had started to emit a melody in itself, much better than the humming that Clarence had tried, much more deep and resonant than even the tree man before him. They looked at each other and they said, with unspoken antagonism, "This deal just won't do." They started circling about one another, looking to each other's eyes, knowing that a toenail for a toenail was such intimacy, such weird and wild communication of friendship that maybe they needed to trust each other more. At one point, Clarence thought, I can run for it. I can try and get away. But no, he knew he couldn't. At one point, he thought, I could use the toenail as a weapon. In fact, he even looked down at it, now 37 feet long, and thought I could wield it like a massive sword. But no, it seemed wrong to take anything of such beauty, of such color, of such humming elegance, and use it for violence. Then he thought, maybe I can trick the tree man. Maybe I can pretend to give him the toenail, accept his wooded toenail, and then I will be the victor. So he says to the tree man, I accept your bargain. The tree man reached down to his long, barky feet that looked themselves to be as old as redwoods and as wrinkly as the crust of the earth, and he peeled off a large piece of bark. And the tree man said, Take my toenail and my blessings, Clarence. Clarence thought, now's my chance. Now's my opportunity. Now I can fool the tree man and be powerful of him in all the forest. Then he heard a voice coming out of the humming, Clarence, Clarence, no. And he looked down and he saw the toenail was talking to him. The Toenail had curled up, curling up into a figure, and he now saw that at the very end, the edges had sprayed out into hands, and the hands were as colorful as a toenail overall. And the mouth was a beautiful figure, the face like that of an angel, but with slight toenail energy to it. And the Toenail angel said to him, "I am not for bargaining. I am not to be given or taken. I am the one who will choose whose toe I allot myself to. Now, Clarence, I have taken you into the forest, and because I am here, I can now take the tree man into the village." And just like that, she disappeared into smoke and dust, traveled through the air, and landed on the tree's toe. And right where the tree's toenail had been, sprouted 4 mushrooms, all of them iridescent with the colors of the rainbow. And Clarence looked down at his own foot and saw his own toe was back to normal size, back to a way that could really respectably fit in any shoe that he might choose to wear, but had a barkish tint to it. And now the tree man realized he had a bit of the village in him. And Clarence realized, well, he had a bit of the forest in him. And the two realized that without fighting, without bargaining, they had become friends. And the two walked on to the next village to meet up with Philip, not for a cure, not for some wisdom, but just for a cup of tea and a chat on the front porch. The end.
Owen, do you have energy for one more story?
I do.
The word is skull.
There once was a little girl, and this little girl found life horribly uninteresting. She would even say boring. She lived in the middle of a city in a small house with her mother and father. Every day she would go to school and learn numbers, dates, history, science projects, but all of them left her flat. None of them seemed, vibrant. In fact, I don't think she even knew the word vibrant. She knew words like beige, adequate, pop quiz. Then one day her parents said, for the weekend, we're going into the mountains for a vacation at an Airbnb. And she sighed, great, I'll be bored in the mountains instead of bored at home. And she brought along her phone, and she brought along her iPad, and she brought along her music, and sat in the back seat, and the family drove into the mountains. And sure enough, her parents were arguing about directions, and squabbling about politics, and talking about the news, just like they always did, and she found it all so boring. Now, while she was still in the city, she would check in on her friends and see if there were any new videos there people were talking about, or songs, or dances. All of it very much like the last song she had heard, or the same dance that she had seen. All of it the same gossip, sort of spiraling around. All of it very, very boring. For a while, she counted the buildings as she passed, all of them gray, all of them with windows, some 7 stories, some 8, some 4, all of them rather boring numbers. And finally, she got to the bridge where the city ended and the countryside began, and she noticed there were no buildings as she left the city, and she found that slightly more interesting. In fact, as she got a little further on, she found that the iPad and phone started losing range, and now she thought, well, I'm really gonna be bored. I can't even look at TikTok anymore. And then the woods got a little thicker, and the road started steeping upwards, and she leaned back in her chair because the moving up at such a steep rate. And she found that she was looking at the tips of trees as the car approached them. And the tips of trees sort of seemed to spike the sky, seemed to catch the clouds, seemed to kind of play with the sunlight. And she thought, that's something other than boring, I suppose. And she drifted off just enough, sort of dreaming about treetops and clouds and sunlight. And when she woke up, it was sunset. And the family was pulling up in front of a wooden cabin surrounded by nothing but other trees. And her mother and father were moving in the groceries and carrying in the bags. And even they were a little quieter, not arguing about who was to make dinner or squabbling about the latest political results. They seemed quiet as well. And the little girl looked around and wondered, well, where are the other people? Where are the buildings? What is this Airbnb? And her parents said, oh, we found it on a particular site. We don't even know exactly how it came to us, but it's a very good bargain. We think we should be very, very happy. And the night was being made, and the mother was making a stew, and the father was getting the fire running, and the little girl said, oh, I want to explore upstairs. And she went up the stairs of the house. It was creaky. Every step made a noise. Now, at home in the city, the steps had been so clean and so quiet that she could creep around without making a noise. But here, it's like the house was talking back to her. Every step she made. She was about to step to the very top stair when her mother called Celia, and she ran back down for dinner. Celia was curious. She couldn't wait to go back upstairs and find out what was making all the noise. Why was the house so alive with creaks? So when her parents finished the dinner, they set to work on a game of Monopoly by the fire and asked if she wanted to join. And she said, oh, I'm a little tired of this. Gosh, it's not that late, but I think I'm just going to go to bed. And that's what she did. But Celia wasn't tired at all. She wanted to explore the rest of the upstairs of this house. So she went back up the steps. Celia. She stopped. Did she hear the creaking of the house saying her name? No, surely not. It's just an old house. Celia. But now she was near the top. And now she looked back down, and she could see the flames or the warmth color coming from the living room where her parents were playing a game of Monopoly. And it was warm and bright and orange below, and above her was dark. No light of the day left, not even moonlight. Which way would she go? Now, of course, boring Celia would have gone back down to a game of Monopoly, knowing that, like always, her dad would think he was winning, but her mom would eventually win and have all the different money stored up in her corner. But Celia didn't want to be boring. And it only occurred to her now, for the very first time, that maybe the world wasn't so boring. Maybe she was boring. And she didn't want that, so she stepped up. And now she was on the top floor of this house. And she could feel and see different hallways, but there was such darkness that she couldn't quite find out which direction to go. She walked down one hallway, feeling her way along the wall, until there was a turn down another. She went down there, and then there was another turn and went down there. And finally, seemingly much further than she ever imagined this house to be, she found a door. And when she tried to open it, she opened it just an inch. And then another inch. The door seemed to creak her very name. Would she walk in? Would she enter into a darkness that somehow was even darker than the darkness she was already in? Well, boring Celia never would. Celia didn't want to be boring. So she stepped into the darkness. She went further and further in. When she touched the walls, they were no longer the worn wood of the house that she had been in before. Now they were cold stone, almost like a castle walls she imagined, and some of them seemed cold to the point of dampness. She walked further on, step after step after step, for what seemed like an hour, deeper and deeper into a darkness, and when she looked back, she couldn't even see the shadow of the door in which she had entered. At some point, she called out, "Hello?" And all she heard was the echo of the voice. Echo. "It's me! It's me! It's me! It's me! Celia! Celia! Celia!" She thought, maybe I've gone too far. Maybe it is time to be a little bit boring. That would be okay. And she turned back around, but when she did, she found that the door that had been so far away was now immediately behind her. And it was closed. She reached for the handle and tried to push. She tried to pull. She tried everything, but it wouldn't budge. She slammed on it. "Mom! Dad!" She could feel all her screams being absorbed by the stones around her, soaked up by the wood of the door. Celia. Now this wasn't a creak. This wasn't an echo. This was a voice, and it was coming from somewhere far, far, far behind her. Now she couldn't go back, but she thought maybe there's another hallway. Maybe there's a window. Maybe she could find a telephone or something, some way out. So she knew that her one way to escape whatever situation she was in was to walk deeper into the darkness. And she stepped in further and further, but there were no hallways. There were no turnings. There was just step after step after step, till finally, ahead of her, she saw the slightest flicker of red flame. She thought, oh my God, I've made it back to my parents. I've made it back to the living room. They're probably playing Monopoly now. Maybe I can still join in the game. And she started running. Even in the darkness, her feet slapping against the cold stone floors. Mom, Dad, she called out until she got to the flame. But it was not the living room she remembered. There was the living room. There was the fireplace. There was the game of Monopoly. But all the pieces were covered with dust and cobwebs, as if they'd been there for 100 years. The furniture itself was moldy and falling apart, and crunched over the Monopoly game as if in mid-game, as if still counting the money before them were her mother and father in the form of skeletons. She took a step closer. Mom, Dad, and there on the mantel, above the fireplace, was a cold, ivory-colored skull. Looked down at her with its non-eyes, into her soul, into her mind, into all of her life, and said, Celia, Celia. Now, boring Celia might have screamed. Boring Celia might have given in. But this was a new Celia. This was the Celia who had been brave enough to climb the stairs. This had been Celia who'd been brave enough to step into the darkness. This had been the Celia who was brave enough to go inside a door, to work and explore and wonder. This was a Celia who was not going to allow for this. And she yelled with every bit of oxygen and life in her lungs, I want my parents back, and ran to the windows and threw open the thick curtains, and in flooded light, morning light, was already the next day, and as the light filled the room, she saw the skeletons of her parents, become fully themselves again. She saw the dust float away. She saw the game of Monopoly come back to its true form, and she saw the skull become the empty rock that it was. And she turned to her parents, who were yawning. We must have fallen asleep in front of the fire, Celia. How about some breakfast? And she said, I think that's a great idea. I know a pancake place back in the city. Let's go. The end.